How are you, buddy?
I'm doing well. How are you guys?
We're all right. You're going to take us to the house tonight. We're going to talk restrictor plate racing back at Daytona, 400 miles this time instead of 500 like we did in February. And it's going to be a little warmer probably this weekend. Tell us what you're seeing in your, whatever it is, crystal ball or helmet, or you're probably looking at a fantasy football or something.
Well, one of the other changes since the last race at Daytona, which took place, or took effect for the race at Talladega, were some of the changes that they've made, trying to break up the pack racing and whatnot. So, really, what I would look at primarily, pretty simply, are the results from the Daytona 500, and then also the most recent race at Talladega. And the guy who really stands out, of course, is Matt Kenseth. He of course, won the Daytona 500, was third at Talladega, actually led the most laps there, more than 3 times the next driver, which kind of surprisingly turned out to be Michael Waltrip, who is in the field this week as well, while Mark Martin is taking about a month off or so.
Eric, last week we had Dan Beaver on the show, and it was right after the announcement had been made that Kenseth was leaving Roush Racing and going somewhere. We didn't know at the time. We still don't officially know, I guess. I asked Dan, even though Kenseth is leading the championship and he's having a good year, at what point would he, what would trigger him to get off of Kenseth with this, potential unrest in his team coming up because he's leaving? And Dan said it wouldn't take very much. He'd get off him real quick. How about you? I mean, how much does that decision to leave and the announcement halfway through the season affect your confidence in that 17 team?
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a great question. I think it's maybe a little different because it's kind of happening mid-season, and it's also, the fact that Kenseth is, right now he's top of the points, and really it doesn't seem to be a situation where there's, really any animosity between him and Roush. So, I would assume, I would hope that, they won't try to, take this out from underneath them and try to leave things, on a good note. We saw last year Tony Stewart won a championship with a crew chief that he knew wasn't going to be with him, the next year. So, I don't think it'll necessarily be a negative unless the Roush Fenway team chooses to make it a negative. I think we kind of maybe saw some of that last year. Mark Martin, we knew, had a lame duck year at Hendrick and didn't really seem to be up to snuff with any of the other guys, in that organization. So you have to wonder, if they just kind of put those guys to the side and didn't, maybe not as much sharing of information and resources and those kinds of things, and just let them fall to the wayside. So it's a difficult question. There's a lot of layers to it, but for right now, I think that it would be foolish for Roush to just pull the carpet out from underneath Matt Kenseth and let him fail, especially given how well he's running and all the the championship aspirations that they have right now.
Of course, we're talking to Eric McClung, Eric writes fantasy racing and other fantasy sports for KFFL.com and Fantasy Football Toolbox. You can follow Eric on Twitter at Eric McClung and catch him here every couple weeks. Eric, we're going to Daytona, going to a plate track. We wouldn't be doing our jobs if we didn't ask about what you think is going to happen with Junior this weekend. I almost hate asking that question going to plate tracks anymore. But we have to. What do you think?
Right.
He's having as good a year as he's maybe ever had as far as championship goes. What do you think?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's been, a top 10, top 5 machine pretty much week in, week out, regardless of where we go, good track, bad track. In terms of his history, certainly he's been very good in the past at Daytona, at Talladega. He was the runner-up at the Daytona 500 in the season opener. Ran well at Talladega, finished 9th there. So, yeah, I mean, I certainly see absolutely no reason why you would not start him for this race other than maybe, everybody else, in your league is going to play him and you want to maybe go with an alternative. But,
right.
Yeah, I certainly have no problems starting him this week at all.
All right, looking at your overall Yahoo team for this weekend, tell the fans out there what you're thinking and how you're leaning, and when will you make your final call? After practice, I'm assuming.
Well, the A-list, I like Kyle Busch quite a bit. There is a lot of risk. He has had some engine and equipment problems, for several weeks in a row recently. Yeah. Although last week at Kentucky probably would have won that race if not for clipping the wall, and I think he broke a sway bar. No, it was a shock issue that he had, but looked absolutely phenomenal for the early portion of that race. When you look at what he's done at Daytona versus the entire field, he leads all drivers in both driver rating and average running position, two very important lead data statistics. He's definitely a guy that I want to take a look at. He was the runner-up at Talladega as well, so that helps. Already mentioned Matt Kenseth. He's an A-list driver. I think he's a very good start. Brad Keselowski, of course, was the winner last week at Kentucky. Also won earlier in the season at Talladega. Pretty much a lock at this point to make the chase. Can pretty much run whatever style of race he wants to run this week. So I think he's a guy, obviously, he's got a lot of confidence and in a very good situation to win a second restricted plate race of the season. Kevin Harvick is a pretty good guy at Daytona as well. He's finished in the 7th position the last 2 races at Daytona. So those are pretty much the 4 guys on the A-list that I like quite a bit. The B-list, we already talked about Junior. From there, I think it's very, very wide open. Greg Biffle has been very good at plate races this season, top 5s in both races. But at this point, if you're like me, you've started him quite a bit, so you may want to look for some alternatives. Jamie Murray's an interesting situation. A couple of years ago, he probably had one of the best runs on restricted plate races that we've seen, winning and runner-up finishes consecutively over the course of a couple races there. He crashed in the Daytona 500, but finished very respectable at Talladega with an 11th place result. One other guy, I kind of in that McMurray category of a very risky option, is Jeff Burton. We pretty much have not seen Jeff Burton pretty much all this season, except for unrestricted plate races. He finished 5th in the Daytona 500, 10th at Talladega. He only has one other top 10 finish this entire season. So if you're really desperate, maybe from a salary cap league, and you're trying to squeeze in that last guy, I think Jeff Burton is pretty interesting, if not risky option. Clint Boyer, Casey Keene are also guys that I like quite a bit, just based on consistency. Over the last couple of weeks here, they brought it pretty good. So, but again, the B list I think is very wide open, except for Junior. I think he could go a lot of different routes. And then finally on the C list, Trevor Bayne is on the entry list. He finished 8th at Talladega after, I believe he crashed early in the Daytona 500, but of course hasn't won that race in the past. Michael Waltrip, I already mentioned, he finished 10th at Talladega, led the second most laps. So he's in the car for Mark Martin. He did run at Kentucky, even though I don't think anybody ever saw him on the broadcast. It's pretty much a non-factor there. So there's a little bit of concern just based on how poorly he ran there. And then the third option, just to be aware of, is Bill Elliott. He's actually going to be in the field this week. He's with a new team, though, Turner Motorsports. I want to say this is the very first Cup race, I want to say. They have run in the Nationwide and Truck Series in the past, but he probably will get into the field based on his championship provisional. I have no idea what to expect from him. He's more of a, like I mentioned with Burton, a very kind of desperation type of option. If you're trying to save a lot of money in a salary cap league or something like that, don't think he's a guy you would probably want to use on your Yahoo team unless you put him on your bench and just kind of see how he qualifies and does in the practice sessions. But other than that, he's pretty risky.
All right, who would you just absolutely in the A-list just stay the hell away from this week? Because that's probably who I'm going to pick.
Well, I think a lot of people will probably be tempted to take Jeff Gordon based on his history at Daytona. He's been pretty good over the course of his career.
Yeah.
He has certainly looked and gotten some better finishes over recent weeks. But he's so desperate for a win that maybe would be concerned on a restricted plate race that, maybe he's going to do something kind of dumb and, spark an accident or get wrecked himself or something along those lines. So he's probably a guy that I would stay away from based on the fact, when you're looking at the numbers, you may be tempted to go that way. Tony Stewart actually has very good loop data statistics at Daytona. I mentioned how Kyle Busch is number 1 in both driver rating and average running position. Tony Stewart is number 2 in both of those categories. But he rarely gets those types of finishes at Daytona, even though he does typically perform and run well. The finishes haven't really panned out. So I think, things could go either way with him. He's probably not a guy that I would want to start. The other guys I mentioned, I think, are a better way to go. Like I said, Kansas has been phenomenal. Busch and Keselowski I like quite a bit. Those are probably, one of the guys that I would take as my number 2 option.
Okay, he is Eric McClung. You can follow him on Twitter at Eric McClung. Read his fantasy sports columns at KFFL.com and Fantasy Football Toolbox. Eric, thanks again for your time this week. Good luck with your picks and your teams at Daytona. We'll be watching you on Twitter as the weekend goes on.
All right, thank you.
All right, Steve-O, who are you picking?